The courtroom was silent except for the low murmur of spectators shifting in their seats. The morning sun filtered through the high windows, casting long streaks of golden light across the polished wooden floor. The air was thick with anticipation, a kind of suffocating stillness that made even the reporters hesitate before scratching notes onto their notepads. At the defendant's table, Rachel Carter sat motionless. Her posture was perfect, her back straight, shoulders squared. The subtle rise and fall of her chest were the only indicators that she was even breathing. Her dark brown skin caught the light, her sharp eyes scanning the room, taking in everything. The way the judge's fingers tapped against his desk, the occasional glances the jury exchanged, the quiet smirk playing at the corners of Officer Daniel Hayes' lips. Rachel's expression was unreadable. She had learned long ago that silence was a weapon, that restraint could be more unnerving than rage. She clasped her hands together on the table, her fingers barely moving, but her mind was working like a well-oiled machine, analyzing, dissecting, anticipating. The voice of the bailiff cut through the quiet, echoing off the tall walls. Court is now in session. Judge Samuel Grayson presiding. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and Judge Grayson entered, his robes flowing behind him as he took his seat at the elevated bench. He was an older man, his silver hair thinning, his deep-set eyes weary with experience. He had seen cases like this before, far too many to count. But there was something different about this one, something that made him sit up a little straighter, something in the way Rachel Carter carried herself that unsettled him. State versus Rachel Carter, the bailiff announced. The sound of chairs creaking as people shifted filled the room. Rachel rose, moving with the controlled grace of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering her own body. She faced the judge, her expression neutral. Across the room, Officer Daniel Hayes leaned back in his chair, exuding the confidence of a man who had never once had to answer for his actions. His uniform was crisp, his posture relaxed. He met Rachel's gaze and smirked, a small, almost imperceptible lift of his lips. Rachel did not react. Her attorney, James Donovan, a young black man barely 2 years out of law school, swallowed hard and shuffled through his notes. He glanced at her, hoping to find some reassurance in her face, but she did not meet his eyes. Instead, she remained fixed on the judge, waiting. Judge Grayson's voice carried through the courtroom, measured and heavy. "Mr. Donovan, is the defense prepared to proceed?" James cleared his throat, nodding quickly. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge shifted his gaze to the prosecution. "Mr. Wallace, you may call your first witness." Wallace, a seasoned prosecutor with the air of a man who had long since stopped questioning the morality of his work, stood smoothly and buttoned his jacket. He turned toward the jury, his voice confident, controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you will hear testimony from Officer Daniel Hayes, a decorated member of the city's law enforcement, a man who has spent years protecting this community. He was simply doing his job the night he encountered Miss Carter, and what happened next was an unfortunate but necessary response to an escalating situation." Rachel's jaw remained locked, her expression impassive. Wallace turned to the plaintiff's table. "The prosecution calls Officer Daniel Hayes to the stand." There was a rustling of fabric as Hayes stood, smoothing the front of his uniform before making his way to the witness stand. He moved with the kind of exaggerated precision that made it seem like he was performing for an audience, which in a way he was. He took the oath, sat down, and adjusted his uniform once more. Rachel watched him carefully, cataloging every detail. The slight twitch in his fingers, the subtle shift in his posture as he glanced toward the jury, the way he licked his lips just before speaking. These were things most people would overlook. But Rachel noticed everything. Wallace approached, hands clasped behind his back. "Officer Hayes, can you please describe the events of the night in question?" Hayes cleared his throat, his voice steady and authoritative. "I was responding to a disturbance call near the east side of town," he said. "I encountered the defendant, Rachel Carter, standing outside a closed business. Given the recent reports of break-ins in the area, I approached her to ask what she was doing there. Rachel did not move." "And what happened next?" Wallace prompted. "She immediately became hostile," Hayes continued. "She refused to identify herself, raised her voice, and when I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she physically assaulted me." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Rachel remained motionless. Hayes shifted in his seat, feigning a pained expression. "She hit me in the chest and reached for my service weapon. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain her." From the back of the room, someone muttered under their breath, "Sounds like a lie." Heads turned, but the judge quickly called for order. Wallace nodded. "Thank you, Officer Hayes. No further questions." Judge Grayson turned toward the defense table. "Mr. Donovan, your witness." James inhaled sharply and stood, clutching his notes as though they were a lifeline. He hesitated for half a second before stepping forward. "Officer Hayes," he began, his voice a little shaky, "you testified that my client resisted arrest and attempted to assault you. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And you also stated that she reached for your service weapon?" "That's correct." James nodded. "And yet, Officer Hayes, you provided no physical evidence to support this claim. No fingerprints on your holster. No corroborating testimony. Just your word." Hayes' jaw tightened. "I know what I saw." James tilted his head. "Do you?" "Because we intend to show that your recollection of events is not only incorrect but intentionally misleading." More murmurs spread through the crowd. Rachel leaned slightly toward James, whispering, "Stay calm. Focus on the facts." James nodded, though his fingers still gripped his notes tightly. The prosecution rested its case, and the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Hayes returned to his seat, his smirk now a full grin. He exchanged a glance with his fellow officers in the back row. Rachel noticed the wink he gave them. Judge Grayson turned to her. "Miss Carter, it's your turn to testify." Rachel rose from her seat, her movements deliberate. She walked toward the stand, ignoring the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on her. She adjusted the microphone with slow precision before looking directly at the prosecutor. The courtroom fell into silence. "Miss Carter," Wallace said, his tone sharp, "can you explain your actions on the night in question?" Rachel leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "I can. But first, I need to clarify something. The officer's account is not only inaccurate but intentionally misleading. A collective intake of breath." Wallace smirked. "Bold accusation, Miss Carter. Do you have any proof to back it up?" Rachel met his gaze, unflinching. "I believe the truth will come to light soon enough." Wallace opened his mouth to retort, but something in her calm confidence made him hesitate. Judge Grayson cleared his throat. "Proceed, Miss Carter." Rachel exhaled slowly, her patience tested but unbroken. Unbeknownst to everyone in the courtroom, the wheels of justice were already turning, and the carefully constructed lies of Officer Daniel Hayes were beginning to crumble. Rachel Carter stepped down from the witness stand, her face calm but unreadable. As she returned to her seat, her attorney, James Donovan, whispered to her, his voice low and filled with tension. "That was bold," he said, adjusting his tie nervously. "But we need more than just confidence, Rachel. We need proof." Rachel did not answer immediately. Instead, she sat down, folding her hands neatly on the table, her eyes still locked on Officer Daniel Hayes. She could see the slight shift in his posture, the tightening of his jaw. He was trying to maintain his usual arrogance, but something had changed. He was nervous. James exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his forehead. "Tell me you have something," he muttered under his breath. Rachel finally turned to look at him. Her expression was as controlled as ever, but there was something in her eyes that made his breath catch. A quiet, steady determination. "Meet me at my house tonight," she said. "I'll tell you everything." James hesitated. "Everything?" Rachel gave the smallest of nods. "Everything." The drive to Rachel's house was longer than James expected. He followed the GPS down winding back roads lined with towering oak trees, their long shadows stretching across the pavement under the glow of the streetlights. The further he drove, the quieter it became, the city lights fading behind him. When he finally pulled up in front of the small but well-kept house, he hesitated for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Something about this case had unsettled him from the beginning. Not just the tension in the courtroom, not just the way Hayes had smirked as though he was untouchable. It was Rachel herself. She was unlike any client he had ever defended. He stepped out of the car and walked up the stone path leading to the front door. A single porch light cast a soft glow over the wooden steps. He knocked twice, his fingers tightening into a fist as he waited. The door opened almost immediately. Rachel stood there, dressed in a simple navy sweatshirt and black leggings. Her hair was tied back, her face bare of any courtroom polish. It was the first time he had seen her like this, and for a moment he hesitated. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. James entered, his eyes scanning the space. The living room was neat, sparsely decorated. A single couch sat against the wall, facing a fireplace. Above the mantel was a framed photograph, Rachel, younger, standing in uniform next to an older man in a matching uniform. There was an American flag folded neatly in a glass case beside it. James turned back to Rachel, his curiosity piqued. "You live alone?" "For now," she answered, walking past him toward a small wooden bookshelf in the corner of the room. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books before selecting a worn leather folder. The edges were frayed, the cover slightly faded. She placed it on the coffee table in front of him and sat down across from him in a chair. James eyed the folder but did not reach for it. "What is this?" "My service record," Rachel said simply. James frowned. "Your service record?" Rachel nodded. "Everything you need to know about me is in there." James hesitated, then slowly reached for the folder. His fingers brushed against the rough leather as he opened it. The first page was a list of commendations. The second was a discharge paper. The third was a list of training certifications. His eyes widened as he scanned the documents, flipping through them faster. He stopped on one particular page, reading the words again, as if his mind was refusing to process them. "Lieutenant Commander Rachel Carter," he murmured under his breath. He looked up at her, stunned. "You were in the Navy?" Rachel tilted her head slightly. "I was a Navy SEAL." James let out a slow, disbelieving breath. "Lieutenant Commander," he repeated, shaking his head. "Rachel, this changes everything. Why didn't you tell me before? Rachel leaned back in her chair, watching him carefully. Because it was never about me, she said. It was about what Hayes represents. James ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The jury won't see you as a defendant anymore. They'll see a hero, he said. Rachel exhaled through her nose, her expression hard. That's what Hayes is afraid of, she said. James rubbed his temples, glancing back down at the folder. The prosecution is going to lose their minds when they hear this, he said. Rachel's lips curved slightly. Let them. James let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. Do you think Hayes knows? Not yet, Rachel said. But he's suspicious. You saw how he looked at me today. He knows there's something he doesn't know, and it's eating at him. James let out a long breath, closing the folder carefully and placing it back on the table. So what's the plan? He asked. Rachel stood, her presence commanding even in casual clothes. She walked over to the mantel, picking up the folded flag. She turned it over in her hands before looking back at him. Tomorrow we show the court the truth, she said. But we don't just expose Hayes for lying. We expose the system that enables him. James frowned slightly. And how do we do that? Rachel placed the flag back on the mantel, her fingers lingering on the glass. We make them see me, she said. Not as a defendant, not even as a Navy SEAL, but as the woman who spent 20 years protecting the very freedoms that man tried to strip from me. James felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear, from the sheer force of her resolve. Rachel, he said softly, tomorrow's going to be a fight. Rachel turned to him, her eyes fierce. I've been fighting my whole life, James, she said. Tomorrow is just another battle. The next morning, the courthouse loomed in the pale gray light of dawn. A crowd had already gathered on the steps, reporters jostling for position, camera crews setting up. The story had spread overnight, whispers turning into full-blown speculation. Inside, the courtroom was packed, the gallery filled with spectators, journalists, and fellow officers. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Rachel sat at the defense table, her face calm but focused. She wore a navy blue blazer over a crisp white shirt. A simple, clean look. Nothing extravagant. But there was something about her presence that commanded the room even before the judge entered. James flipped through his notes beside her, his knee bouncing under the table. Are you ready for this? He asked under his breath. Rachel turned her head slightly, her expression steady. I've been ready for years, James, she said. Let's give them the truth. The gavel struck, and Judge Grayson entered the room. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. The prosecutor, Wallace, stood first. He adjusted his suit, his face carefully neutral. Your Honor, we intend to reinforce the testimony of Officer Hayes today and present additional evidence to support the charges against the defendant. Rachel did not react. Her hands rested lightly on the table, her fingers barely moving. James leaned toward her, whispering, "Here we go." Wallace turned toward the prosecution's table. The prosecution calls Officer Daniel Hayes back to the stand. There was a heavy silence as Hayes stood, adjusting his tie before making his way to the witness stand. James exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over the room. Rachel sat still, her gaze locked on Hayes. The battle had begun. The courtroom was eerily silent as Officer Daniel Hayes made his way to the witness stand. The air felt thick, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. The jury watched him with measured expressions, their eyes flicking from the prosecution to the defense, absorbing every detail. The tension in the room was almost suffocating. Rachel Carter sat at the defense table, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood. She didn't fidget, didn't glance around nervously. She simply watched. It was not the watchful gaze of someone on trial. It was the gaze of a predator who knew exactly when to strike. Hayes adjusted his uniform before sitting down, his posture stiff. He took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. The confidence he had exuded in his first testimony was still there, but something about it seemed forced now. He was more calculated in his movements, his shoulders too squared, his expression too neutral. Prosecutor Wallace approached the stand, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a careful mask of professionalism. "Officer Hayes," he began, "thank you for returning to testify. I understand that trials can be stressful, but I appreciate your willingness to clarify the facts for the court." Hayes nodded, shifting slightly in his seat. Of course. Wallace paced slightly in front of the jury. "Now, Officer Hayes, yesterday you provided the court with your account of the events that took place on the night in question. You stated that the defendant, Rachel Carter, resisted arrest, became aggressive, and attempted to seize your service weapon. Do you stand by this testimony?" Hayes nodded. "Yes, I do." Wallace gave an approving nod before turning to the jury. "There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. A trained and experienced officer, acting in the interest of public safety, forced into a difficult situation by an uncooperative and aggressive individual. No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Grayson turned to James Donovan. "Mr. Donovan, your witness." James stood slowly, his expression unreadable. He buttoned his jacket, straightened his tie, and walked toward the stand. He took his time, each step deliberate. "Officer Hayes," he said calmly, "yesterday you testified that my client was aggressive and non-compliant. Is that correct?" "That is correct," Hayes answered. "And that she reached for your weapon?" "Yes." James nodded as if considering the response. He took a few steps closer, his gaze locked on Hayes. "You stated that your body camera malfunctioned during this encounter," he said. "Is that also correct?" Hayes cleared his throat. "Yes. It was an unfortunate coincidence." James raised an eyebrow. "A coincidence," he repeated. "You have been on the force for 10 years, correct?" "Yes." "In those 10 years, how often has your body camera malfunctioned during an arrest?" Hayes hesitated for the first time. It was slight, but Rachel saw it. A small pause, the flicker of his eyes toward Wallace, the way his fingers curled slightly against the armrest. "Not often," Hayes admitted. James tilted his head slightly. "Not often," he repeated. "But it happened during this particular arrest, the one where you claimed the defendant was aggressive. Convenient, wouldn't you say?" Hayes shifted in his seat. "I don't control the equipment." James turned and took a few slow steps in front of the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an officer who claims my client was aggressive, who claims she reached for his weapon, who claims he had no choice but to restrain her. And yet, conveniently, the one piece of objective evidence that could support his claims is missing." Murmurs spread through the gallery. James let the silence stretch before turning back to Hayes. "Officer Hayes," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel, "is it also a coincidence that a witness in the area captured part of this encounter on their phone?" The courtroom erupted into whispers. Hayes' face paled slightly. His lips parted, but no words came out. Judge Grayson banged his gavel. "Order in the court," he said sharply. He turned to James. "Mr. Donovan, if you have evidence, present it now." James nodded and returned to the defense table. He retrieved a USB drive and handed it to the bailiff, who inserted it into the courtroom's media system. The screen flickered to life. The footage was shaky, taken from behind the windshield of a parked car. The audio was clear, though, and that was all that mattered. Hayes' voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said. Then came Rachel's voice, steady but firm. "I'm not resisting. Let go of my arm." The crowd watched, riveted, as Hayes shoved Rachel against the patrol car. His next words were clear. "Women like you don't get to question me." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, a few audible expletives from the gallery. Judge Grayson banged his gavel harder this time. "Order," he barked. "I will have order in this court." Rachel sat still, her hands folded neatly on the table. James stood, waiting for the chaos to settle. When the courtroom fell silent again, he turned to Hayes, whose face was now visibly tense. "Officer Hayes," James said, his voice low and controlled. "Would you care to explain that statement?" Hayes swallowed hard. "I was trying to de-escalate the situation," he said. "She was being uncooperative." James took a step closer. "She was asking why you were demanding her identification. That's not uncooperative. That's a constitutional right." Hayes shifted. "She was confrontational." James' expression darkened. "Is that what you call a black woman asking questions? Confrontational?" Hayes' mouth opened, then closed. James turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense has one final piece of evidence to submit." He walked back to the defense table and retrieved another file. "This," he said, holding it up for the jury, "is Officer Hayes' personnel record. It contains multiple complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and misconduct. Complaints that were buried, ignored, or dismissed without consequence." Wallace leapt to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant to the case at hand." Judge Grayson held up a hand. "Overruled. Continue, Mr. Donovan." James handed copies to the jury, watching their faces as they scanned the pages. "This," he said, "is not about one bad decision. This is about a pattern of abuse. A pattern that culminated in the false arrest and mistreatment of my client." The murmurs grew louder. The judge's face darkened. Even Wallace seemed to shrink slightly. James turned to Rachel. "And now," he said, "it's time for her to speak her truth." Rachel rose, her movements deliberate. She walked to the front of the courtroom, standing tall, her presence commanding. "My name is Rachel Carter," she said, her voice clear. "For 20 years, I served in the United States Navy. I was a Navy SEAL. I have been to places most people cannot imagine, faced dangers most will never know. And through it all, I have held myself to the highest standards of integrity and discipline." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. "I have faced enemies on the battlefield," Rachel continued. "But I never thought I would face one in my own country. That night I wasn't a threat. I wasn't breaking any laws. I was simply existing. And for Officer Hayes, that was enough to make me a target." The silence in the room was deafening. Rachel turned to Hayes, her gaze steady. "You underestimated me," she said. "But more importantly, you underestimated the truth. And the truth has a way of revealing itself." Hayes looked away, his face flushed. Rachel turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I fought for this country. And today I fight for justice. Not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been silenced by those in power." The courtroom erupted into applause, despite the judge's attempts to restore order. James placed a hand on her shoulder, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well," he murmured, "let's see how long that wall holds." The courtroom was heavy with silence. The air felt thick, the weight of the trial still pressing down on everyone present. The jury had been out for hours, deliberating, combing through every piece of evidence, every testimony, every contradiction that had unraveled in front of them. The once confident Officer Daniel Hayes now sat hunched over at the prosecution's table, his hands clenched together, his face pale. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced with a quiet tension that even his attorney, Wallace, couldn't disguise. Rachel Carter sat at the defense table, her expression unreadable. She had not moved much since the jury had been dismissed, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her back straight as ever. James Donovan, seated beside her, tapped his fingers against his briefcase, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. He had done all he could. The rest was up to the jury. The courtroom door opened, and the bailiff stepped inside, his face giving away nothing. "The jury has reached a verdict." A ripple of energy swept through the room as people shuffled in their seats, whispering to each other. The judge entered shortly after, his robes flowing as he took his seat at the bench. The jury was called in, each member filing into their seats, their faces serious and unreadable. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with a calm but firm presence, stood with a folded piece of paper in her hands. She looked toward the judge, her voice steady. "Your Honor, we have reached a verdict." Judge Grayson nodded. "Please read the verdict." The forewoman unfolded the paper, took a slow breath, and then spoke the words that would change everything. "In the case of State versus Rachel Carter, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges." For a brief moment, the courtroom was completely silent, as if time itself had paused. And then the whispers began, spreading like wildfire through the gallery. Some murmured in relief, others in disbelief. A few gasps echoed, followed by hushed conversations. Rachel exhaled slowly, her shoulders finally relaxing. She had expected this outcome, but the reality of it settling in still brought a wave of emotion crashing over her. She turned slightly, meeting James' eyes. He grinned, relief flooding his face. The forewoman continued, her voice unwavering. "Furthermore, we the jury strongly recommend an internal investigation into Officer Hayes' conduct during this incident." The air in the room shifted instantly. Even Judge Grayson straightened in his chair, his eyes darkening slightly. He turned his gaze toward Hayes, who was now visibly sweating, his fingers tightening around the armrests of his chair. "The court will take this recommendation under advisement," the judge said. "Officer Hayes, I strongly suggest you retain legal counsel. This matter is far from over." Hayes swallowed hard, his face drained of color. Wallace, the prosecutor, rubbed his temples, looking like a man who had just realized he had backed the wrong horse. The judge struck his gavel. "Court is adjourned." Rachel stood slowly, turning to face James. He let out a slow breath before shaking his head in disbelief. "I think you just changed everything," he muttered. Rachel offered him the smallest of smiles. "Not everything, just the parts that needed changing." Outside the courthouse, a storm of reporters and cameras waited, their voices merging into a chaotic symphony of questions and flashes. The moment Rachel and James stepped outside, the swarm descended. "Rachel, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you think justice was served today? What do you have to say to Officer Hayes?" Will you be pressing charges against the department? Rachel held up a hand, silencing the barrage of questions. She stood tall, her presence commanding. The crowd quieted just enough for her voice to carry. This isn't just my victory, she said. This is a victory for accountability, for justice, for every person who has ever been told their truth does not matter. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing every second. I did not fight this battle alone, she continued, and I won't stop fighting for others. A wave of applause erupted from a section of the crowd. Rachel held their gazes for a moment longer before turning to leave, ignoring the continued questions shouted at her back. James walked beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets, a small smirk playing on his lips. You really know how to make an exit, he muttered. Rachel chuckled. Comes with practice. As they reached the car, James hesitated. He glanced back at the crowd, at the courthouse that still loomed behind them. What now? He asked. Rachel paused for a moment before looking at him. Justice never rests, James, and neither do I. She opened the car door and got in, leaving him standing there watching her go. Months later, the fallout from the trial was still unfolding. Officer Daniel Hayes had been dismissed from the police force. Investigations into his past cases uncovered a disturbing pattern of misconduct. Complaints that had once been buried were now being re-examined. His former colleagues suddenly unwilling to defend him. The prosecutor, Wallace, faced scrutiny for his role in trying to bury the truth. The public demanded accountability. The department, once steadfast in its defense of Hayes, was now scrambling to repair its damaged reputation. Rachel Carter had returned to a quiet life, but she could not escape what she had become. She was no longer just a woman who had been wrongfully accused. She had become a symbol. Requests flooded in. Speaking engagements, interviews, advocacy opportunities. People wanted to hear her story, wanted to learn how she had stood her ground. She stood in front of a packed auditorium one evening, facing a crowd of eager faces. The energy in the room was electric, the kind of anticipation that came before something powerful. She took a breath, her voice steady as she began. For 20 years I fought on battlefields. I thought I had seen the worst of humanity. But nothing could have prepared me for what I faced in my own country, in my own city, at the hands of someone who was supposed to protect and serve. The room was silent, captivated. But here is what I have learned. The fight for justice does not belong to one person. It belongs to all of us. A ripple of applause spread through the crowd. Do not let fear silence you, she continued. Do not let them tell you that your voice does not matter. Because it does. It always has. The applause grew louder, the room filling with energy. Rachel let them cheer, let the moment settle before she finished. I did not stand alone, and neither should you. The crowd rose to their feet, the thunderous applause filling the space. Rachel stood there, letting it wash over her, knowing that this was only the beginning. She had left the battlefield years ago, but the fight had never really ended. And she was ready for whatever came next. Because justice was not just an outcome. It was a way of life,